Sayakat Cosplay, and welcome to part 3 of the Learn to Sew with Sayakat series. Today is going to be about hand sewing basics. So if you'd like to learn a little bit more about hand sewing, stick around and I'm going to show you some of the basic hand sewing stitches that are very commonly used. If you've watched this video and you have any additional questions, please leave a comment down below. It really helps me out, as does hitting the like button and hitting that subscribe button as well if you like the content on this here channel. Okay, so learning to sew by hand isn't that difficult. The first thing you need to learn is how to thread a needle. Now, there are needle threaders that you can get in like little repair kits, sewing kits that are great for threading needles. I don't actually own a needle threader to do that. To thread a needle, you're going to want to have a nice blunt edge on the thread. So you want to make sure that it's either freshly cut or very blunt. You don't want little fibers sticking up off of it, because it's going to get really hard to thread into your needle. Now, I usually take it and wet it in my mouth, just that makes it a little bit easier to thread the needle, and stick it right through and then pull through. There's a couple different ways to sew by hand. You can sew with the thread fully doubled over and both ends knotted together, or you can sew with one end free. I'm going to be sewing with both ends knotted together, but if you want one thickness of thread only, you can leave that one end unknotted. Okay, so I've threaded my needle. Now I need to knot off the end of the thread so that when I pull it through the fabric that I'm going to be sewing, it doesn't just go right through. The way that I got taught to tie off a knot is to wrap it around my forefinger and then wrap it back over once and then twice, and then roll it up off my finger and then pull the threads so that you end up with a nice little knot. This method is not going to be the nicest of knots, nicest or prettiest of knots, but it makes a nice thick knot so that it's not going to pull through the fabric. I'm sure there's many different ways of doing it. I know there's a way of wrapping it around the needle and then pulling it, but basically you want to be able to make a knot that's not going to pull through the fabric. So you want to make a fairly beefy knot. So when do you want to consider hand sewing versus machine sewing? Hand sewing is often used for applying buttons, snaps, hooks and eyes, other types of closures, sewing on pieces that are delicate or you need to secure down seam allowances, basting. There's many different reasons why you might want to be hand sewing instead of machine sewing. So I'm going to show you a couple of the basic hand sewing stitches. I'm going to be demonstrating on a little bit of muslin that is just left over from another project. So this is just cotton muslin. It's unbleached cotton. It's usually used for patterning, but today it's going to serve as our little template for hand stitching. So the first stitch I'm going to demonstrate here is called a basting stitch. This is a variation on the running stitch, which I'm also going to demonstrate in a minute. Basting stitches are really long stitches, and you just go through. It's an over-under motion with your needle. Pull, and there you go. You get a couple of basting stitches in. This is basically just a really long running stitch. It's called a running stitch because you just run your needle through the thread, through the fabric. I mean, I'm guessing that's why it's called a running stitch. I didn't name these things. And that's how you do a basting stitch. When you're basting, you generally don't want to tie off at the ends, but I'm going to show you how I knot off on this one, and then that's basically how I knot off for everything. There's a couple different ways to knot off your thread. So I'm going to show you one of the ways here, which is basically just going to right close to where you want to end the stitching. Just go through the loop of the thread and knot off. I didn't do that very cleanly. And you're going to want to do that a couple times. I always do it 3 times. So I loop again and I loop again. So I was taught to always tie off 3 times. It's really nice and secure there. There's a couple of different things you can do with the thread now. You can just cut it off here. Or if you want the tails to be hidden in between layers, you can take your needle and go through a little bit of fabric, pull through, and then cut off. And once you tug the fabric, that tail gets hidden in between the fabric. All right, that's our basting stitch. Now for the running stitch, which is basically a much smaller basting stitch. So you're going to take up very small amounts of fabric with your needle. You want to try to make how much fabric you pick up with the needle about as even as you can. If you don't like picking up multiple stitches at once, just take it one at a time. Hand sewing can be very relaxing, I find. Sometimes I just want to sit and have a cup of tea and hand sew and watch a TV show. All right, and that is a basic running stitch. Now there's another way I'm going to show you how to tie off, especially if you have very little thread left, and that's to actually cut it about 2.5 inches away from your last stitch. And you can take your threads and then tie them in knots a couple of times. So you're going to take your 2 threads and then tie them around each other. I find this type of knotting isn't quite as secure just because it's not going back through the fabric. You're not you're not backing up the knot with fabric, but it is a good way of tying off if you have very little thread left on your needle and you can't get the needle back around. Okay, so a basting stitch is just to basically hold 2 pieces of fabric together until you put your more permanent stitching in. Running stitches are more secure than basting stitches, but if you accidentally pull on the thread and the knot comes undone, it's not the most secure way of sewing together your fabric. The next stitch I'm going to show is called a back stitch, and it is much more secure than a running stitch and looks more like machine sewing than anything else that I'm going to be showing you. With back stitching, you're going to bring your needle through, up, and then back. So you're kind of 1 step forward, 1 step back, sort of a sewing motion. So by looping the thread back, you are creating a much more secure line of stitching than just with a running stitch. And I'm not doing the most straightest of lines here, but hopefully you get the idea. So you go in at the base of the last stitch and then out about half the distance away from where the thread comes out. So in at that last stitch, out past the thread. And that is a back stitch. All right, I'm gonna tie this off. I like how my lines of demo stitching just keep getting shorter and shorter. The next stitch I'm gonna show you is called a whip stitch. This is also sometimes called an overcast stitch, also sometimes called a felling stitch. Whip stitches are often used to secure hems. They're often used to secure seam allowances down to a garment. There's a lot of different uses for whip stitching. I'm gonna fold this down and pull it through both thicknesses of fabric. So you're whipping the thread over the edge. And they kind of end up at a diagonal, so you can decide to whip in one direction or another. And then a variation on the whip stitch is called a blanket or a buttonhole stitch, where instead of just whipping it, you also bring the thread and kind of almost tie a knot with it. A blanket or a buttonhole stitch is a basically more secure version of a whip stitch. This is also used for edging blankets and for edging buttonholes. So whip, blanket. I have two more types of stitching to show, which is the slip stitch and the invisible stitch. So slip stitching is when you slip your needle through one side of a seam and then slip it through to the other side. So it's kind of like a running stitch. Often slip stitching or invisible stitching is used to secure like pillow edges or things that have been stuffed. So you're just picking up a little bit of fabric with your thread on one side and then picking up on the other side. So you can see I'm slipping the thread between the sides of the fabric and then pull tight. And it does look like a running stitch on the top or the side, but it's a little different than a running stitch because you're sewing between edges. And now the invisible stitch, you're only going to pick up a couple of threads on one side and then a couple of threads on the other. So an invisible stitch is basically a slip stitch, but you're being more careful with it to not go all the way through. So slip stitching and invisible stitching are useful when you're working with multiple layers of fabric and maybe putting trim on something, or you want an invisible hem on something. So you can see the stitching on the slip stitching, which is done pretty messily. But on the invisible stitching, it's there, but you can't see it on the top or on the bottom because I've only been going through the one thickness of the fabric and leaving the top thickness free. So those are the basics of hand sewing. There's some more complex types of hand stitches, but really this is what you need to know to get started. So that's pretty much how to get started with hand sewing. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you folks for part 4, learning to sew with a machine.